It's my pleasure tonight to introduce someone who has done more than her fair share of introducing audiences to the delights of art history, the cultural historian, broadcaster, and author Janina Ramirez. Janina works at the Department for Continuing Education at the University of Oxford, and since 2010, we have seen her on our screens. She's appeared regularly on BBC4, presenting a host of series, from Treasures of the Anglo-Saxons and the Private Lives of Medieval Kings, to An Art Lover's Guide, Handmade in Bolton, and most recently for BBC Two, Raiders of the Lost Past. Her books include The Private Lives of the Saints, introductions to Julian of Norwich and to the 6th century hero Beowulf, and 2 books for children set in a fictional Viking village. Her latest projects are a book that she's currently writing on goddesses for the British Museum, and another called Femina, A New History of the Middle Ages, which is coming out in March of next year. And tonight we're incredibly lucky to be getting a sneak preview of that book, which looks at some of the key women who have been written out of the medieval history books. What do the stories of these influential women do to reshape our thinking of the Middle Ages as a time of bloodthirsty Vikings and kings, and of a patriarchal society that only oppressed women? Why were these remarkable women removed from the history books? And how can their stories help reshape our contemporary understanding of the past? Before I pass over to Janina to tell us more, just a quick reminder that if you have any questions for her, you can type them into the Q&A box, which you can find by clicking the Q&A button in the Zoom panel at the bottom of your screen. We're planning for there to be about 10 minutes or so for questions at the end. And if you'd like to see captions while Janina is talking, just go to the button that says close captioning and it'll turn that feature on for you. So without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Janina to tell us more about the medieval world with the women written back in.
Thank you so much, Jackie. What a lovely introduction. I'll bring up my PowerPoint now. Hopefully you can all see that okay. Yes, it's an exciting evening for me tonight because this is the first time I am sharing the contents of my forthcoming book, Femina. Now, it is out in March, but it is available to pre-order. And it would be wonderful if you have enjoyed this talk, if you pre-ordered it. It's very exciting for me. It's the culmination of many, many years of research, but even more years thinking about this issue of writing women back into the Middle Ages. As Jackie mentioned, I've written 2 books in lockdown. I've been a busy bee, and the other one is in collaboration with the British Museum. It's called Goddesses, and I can share with you again, I've been allowed to share with you, although it doesn't come out till February, some of the insides of the book. And you can see I cover the whole globe. It was a huge exercise writing this. I worked in collaboration with over 50 curators from the British Museum, and we move across all of the continents and across tens of thousands of years of spirituality and belief to find these female individuals, and we refer to them as goddesses, spirits, saints, and other female deities. And it has been such a learning curve for me because many of you will know I'm a medievalist. I tend to work mostly on European material, which I'll be talking about today, but it has opened my eyes to the complexity of different cultures, different belief systems across the world. And certainly it was a great companion in lockdown to be exploring Bali and going over to Mexico in my mind and encountering these goddesses. But it made me think why I've been working so closely on the role of women in history and the importance of finding them again in the archaeological, the art historical, and the historical realms. And I was giving a live talk the other night where I was trying to sort of pull apart my reasoning. And when I was first starting out as an academic, I really didn't engage very much with feminist movements, feminist art. I liked to think that I was a success regardless of my sex, and that being a woman wasn't necessarily something that I thought should solely define me. But as time has moved on certainly over the last 5-10 years, I think there is a pressing need to put the focus back on women, because through that, we can put the focus back on many disenfranchised groups. And it was researching Femina that I found some quite startling modern statistics for the global situation in relation to male-female binaries. And just a few of these statistics are you know, not, they're shocking, and they will make the reason for my research hopefully a bit clearer. There are more CEOs named John than there are women CEOs altogether. It will take 108 years to close the gender gap, and here it says across the 106 countries covered since the first report. This report's from 2019. The biggest gaps to close are in political empowerment and in economics, which will take 202 and 107 years to close respectively. Only 6 countries give women equal legal rights to work as men. Less than 20% of the world's landholders are women. And then down at the bottom, some alarming statistics there about sexual abuse, about trafficking, and about earnings. So I feel very strongly at the moment that when I write history, when I write my books, I want to shift the focus. Now, the way I'm doing that in Femina is to create worlds with women back in. That's exactly as Jackie said at the beginning. It is not to focus exclusively on women. There have been many books published that will tell you the life of Hilda of Bingham, that will tell you how important Christine de Pizan was, that will explain the importance of certain individuals. But the world I'm building up in Femina is a complex one in which women exist within society. And as a result, every chapter has a different texture to it. I use a whole host of disciplinary approaches. So in one case, osteoarchaeology, I use DNA analysis, I move between art history, literary studies, hagiography. But in each of those chapters, I build a world and put the women back into it. And because I think the time is right for a more inclusive view of the past. I remember being at school studying history, and it was all about great white men who achieved things that I could never dream of achieving. And in fact, that was my reason at the very last minute to switch my degree choice from history to literature, because I felt in literature, I could hear voices, I could actually connect with a range of people. But I think that history is changing, transforming as a discipline. Social history has made such a big impact on the way that we now consume the past. So big influences, David Olusoga with his House Through Time, the idea that a building can be traced back through its life cycle, if you like. And of course, Hallie Rubenhold's The Five, which very importantly put the victims back into the story of Jack the Ripper and told their environmental story, put them back in the streets of London and back in context. So I'm building on that very deliberately by creating a medieval world that is textured, that is complex, that really challenges our notions of the medieval period. I grew up watching Monty Python, and the old truism of sort of peasants in muddy fields slopping mud around. I want to challenge all of that and instead create connections with individuals from the past through the objects they held, the buildings they inhabited, the streets they walked on, and the words they have left behind. And I hope through that to bring other people into the story as well. So in my Goddesses book, I traced, and actually in the programs Jackie mentioned at the top, particularly Raiders of the Lost Past, I've been fortunate to expand my historical vista back way beyond where I feel comfortable. These are two images here, one from Holl of Fels, one from Willendorf, of female figurines. And the one on my right is 40,000 years old. And the other one is a mere 25,000 years old. But I have been exploring the relationship between male and female, going back that far, and how women have held positions of power and influence, particularly going back thousands of years. This became increasingly of interest to me as I explored sites like Çatalhöyük in Turkey. I made a program about Çatalhöyük. It dates back to about 9000 BC, and it is called the world's oldest city. It was such a revelation visiting this place. It's like a beehive of equally sized, equally proportioned dwellings. And yet there are no streets going between the buildings. So the way that inhabitants got from house to house was over rooftops and going down ladders. Then there was another fascinating aspect to this, which was that they bury their dead underneath the floors of their houses. So they live alongside their ancestors. But what became obvious when I was working with the archaeologists more recently is studies of the bones, osteoarchaeology and DNA analysis has shown that there was not a distinctive gender divide between the bones of men and the bones of women. So they were doing equal sorts, the same sorts of work. They were eating the same sorts of food. There also didn't seem to be a hierarchical structure with a sort of church precinct and a temple precinct. It was, to all intents and purposes, it seems, quite egalitarian. And out of that, there are all these fascinating images of female bodies. So this clay sculpture, you can see the woman is seated on a throne with two panthers either side, and she's commanding, she's authoritative. Then I also managed to work on Knossos and the Minoans. And more than anywhere, I think this was where I really began to challenge the inherited idea of the second sex. We could go back 40,000 years, 9,000 years, and then here about 3,500 years, and see that women have not been treated as the second sex in certain cultures and civilizations. In Minoan Crete, it is always the women that feature in the important roles. So you can see, for example, two Minoans, they've been called snake goddesses, but they're exceptionally well dressed, and these are obviously sort of iconic objects. And then on the wall paintings, the friezes, you always see women being involved in processions, in positions of authority, whereas the men are always depicted very generically and usually in a subservient role. So when I started to see these challenges to my understanding that I've inherited in the 21st century, that women have always had it worse than men, I wanted to see if that applied to the medieval period. And I set myself a nice big challenge because I like a challenge. I wanted to cover the full period that loosely gets termed Middle Ages. And I don't like that term, obviously. It presumes that we come out of a wonderful high period of classical civilization and we go into a time of modernity, industry, technology, and there's a big chunk of 1,000 years in the middle where nothing really happens. So I'm starting on that premise that I will cover the period from about 700 AD up to about 1400 AD. It's a big chunk of time. But interestingly, I have been able to find individuals within those timeframes that shed a different light on specific locations, specific moments. And each one of the women I study, I bring to life their biography as much as we can know about them. But as I said at the beginning, I wanted to set them against their landscape, against the world that they inhabit, because they're not a single individual in isolation. They are, for example, there's a chapter on Marjorie Kemp where Marjorie we know about because we have her book surviving, the oldest autobiography written in English, and it's an extraordinary work, but it is a work populated with so many other people. And then you can position her in King's Lynn, and you can think about your 14th century King's Lynn, what's happening there, what does she see, what artworks would have been around her. So that's the approach I've taken throughout the book. Now, my intention today is to give you a bit of a taster for what I'm doing by looking at the beginning and the end of the book. So I'm going to spend the first part talking about my very first chapter. You'll notice I've been quite provocative in the chapter headings. I've deliberately named each of the chapters after a quality or a attribute or a title that tends to be laid at the feet of men. So we've got decision makers, we've got polymaths, spies and outlaws, entrepreneurs, kings. And indeed it is the king that I will be talking to you about at the end, King Jadwiga of Poland. So hopefully you can switch your mind between 7th century England and 14th century Poland, but I will aim to be your guide on this journey. I'll just have a quick sip. Okay, come with me now to the very north of England. We are about 18 kilometers from Whitby, And we are on the very edge of the coast at this point that I'm taking you to in about the 7th century. We are in a time of great ideological transformation. And the place I want to take you to is a place called Street House. So you can see it there on that very simple map on the left. And this is what it looks like now from aerial photography. It is a farming landscape, not inhabited, but perhaps you can see from this photograph, but I'll make it clear as we go along, there are numerous marks on the landscape that date back, some of them thousands and thousands of years, because this is a site that has had use, that has been occupied, and particularly it seems maybe, and I know archaeologists hate this term, but there may have been some ritual activity taking place on this site. The reason for that is because, and again, I should note, in each of my chapters, I start with a discovery. So the discovery of the Book of Marjorie Kemp, for example, but also in this case, a discovery made in 2006 by an archaeologist called Steve Sherlock. I like the name. It's the idea of him as an archaeological detective has not been lost on me. Now, Steve was part of a team that decades earlier, had discovered a Neolithic monument, it seems, that they actually ended up naming it the Wasset, which is what is it? Because there was no convincing arguments put forward for this possibly 9,000-year-old structure. But on top of that, on this landscape, you have Iron Age settlements, you have Roman remains, so Roman buildings were on this site as well. And Steve has been excavating this site, as I say, for tens of years. But it was 2006 when he discovered this particular part of the site. And you can see the diagram on the left and then an artist's reconstruction on the right. And what the team uncovered were 109 early medieval burials. And they are arranged east to west. They move around in a frame to a size about a piece of land about the size of half a football pitch, so just to give you a sense of scale. They also discovered a couple of timber frame buildings, and off the 109 graves, 2 in particular had burial mounds raised up on them, and they're the ones referred to here as 43 and 42. You can see that there is clearly a sense that this space was used, that you could move through it. So there's a very obvious break in the burials that indicates some sort of an entrance point. There is a sense that this mound, these buildings, and these 2 graves, 43 and 44, are the center or the focal point for the whole site. And that as you move through, you can then leave the site at the top. So does it have some sort of processional function? What is going on here? Okay, well, this is a model of the individual that was buried in Mound 42. Now, we don't know her name, so I start the whole book with an anonymous woman who is simply referred to as the Loftus Princess. And she, very little remains of her. Bones are very poorly preserved in this soil, but her artifacts remain. The jewels you could see around her neck and the bed that she is buried in. So unusual already. We have a bed being buried in the ground. And of course, the wood doesn't survive very well, but you can see these iron cleats that would have held all the boards in place, and all of the bits of metal that together constituted this bed, they have all been discovered as well. Now, there is a real danger in archaeology, and I highlight this in my second chapter on the Burka warrior woman from Sweden, that gender or sex can be attributed on the basis of finds. So if bones aren't present, as in the case of the Loftus Princess, you might suggest jewelry is female while weaponry is male. And that is definitely flawed. And certainly when it comes to the Burka warrior woman, who was in fact interred with a full armory of weapons for a very long time, over 100 years, that grave was designated a male grave, a male warrior grave. And it was only the recent discoveries of DNA analysis that's taken place in the last 3-4 years that brought to life it was, in fact, a female that was buried in the grave. So I approach this sort of sex assignment on the basis of objects as problematic. But given the range of objects that also survive from around that particular graveyard in N Street House, it does seem fair to refer to this individual as the Loftus Princess. And this is what I'm excited about, art historians. It might not look like a Picasso or a Titian, but I firmly believe that the art historian has so much to bring to the study of objects from the past. And when we're dealing with the early medieval period, this is high art, this is high creativity. So when you have static populations, when you have an opportunity for monumental sculpture, for painting, for architecture on a grand scale, that is, I suppose, what we would more commonly ascribe as art. But when you have a mobile population, when you have people that value things differently, these objects, these sorts of pieces of personal, private jewelry in particular, can be the finest expression of the artistry of the age. Now, the Loftus Princess was buried with a string of beads, it seems, around her neck. We have this coil surviving of gold. We have an exotic bead, these 2 cabochon garnets, and then this really unusual large gold and garnet cloisonné pendant with a central garnet there that is shaped like a scalloped shell. It measures about 2.5 centimeters. So this is a big gemstone. Now, why did this discovery in 2006, why was it so important? Why did it capture my imagination? Why did I want to dedicate a whole chapter of my book to this anonymous woman buried on the Northumbrian coast? Well, I am passionate about this period that tends to be called the Dark Ages. But as I have said in my other books and many, many times on television, I don't consider it dark at all. There is, of course, a falling away of administrative writing, because as Rome cedes possession of the British Isles and control of the British Isles, there is a sense in which there's a documentary vacuum, but there is not an artistic or cultural vacuum. It is transformed and it becomes something different. And it's in understanding that difference that the world can be brought to life more fruitfully. So I have an image here of the famous Staffordshire hoard, recent discovery, the biggest single discovery of early medieval gold ever in one collection ever found. And when it came out of the ground, it was a surprise for me. I was delighted, because up until that point, I'd mainly been limited to small finds and, of course, the Sutton Hoo ship burial, which was discovered in 1939. But when the Staffordshire hoard was discovered, it also was a real confidence booster for me in terms of my research on this material, because there's a consistency of style through these finds that's also found in other early English, certainly medieval pieces of jewelry. And the features you see here are common. There is the desire to use gold, that wonderful chiaroscuro that you get with gold, where it plays with light, and then the use of niello, this sort of copper sulfate, to create a juxtaposition of light and dark on the surface of metal. The consistent use of garnet. This is something that never ceases to amaze me. Garnet is not found commonly in England. So all this gold and garnet jewelry, the actual material itself, the garnet, would have had to have been imported really quite long distances. In Staffordshire hoards, there seems to be 2 sources of garnet. One is Eastern Europe, and the other is India. So this material, whether it's coming in a raw form or it's already been partly processed, it arrives here and then it is transformed into these sorts of pieces of art. The other common features, it's usually zoomorphic. There's usually animals in these pieces. There's interlace, but there's also symmetry and a delight in patterns that you get in these sorts of pieces. So there's something going on that is quite consistent across 100, 150 years, and very much within this region that today we would refer to as England. And that also got me thinking about the literature, the poetry, Old English poetry, the myths, the stories, the things that do survive that give us insights into why these pieces were considered precious. And so I draw your attention to the image on the other side, which is a section from an object known as the Franks Casket. It's held in the British Museum. It's a casket made of walrus tusk, and it's whalebone rather, and it's been reconstructed in its original shape, which is roughly the size of a shoebox. And all over its surface are carved these intricate scenes that they almost have a comic strip quality to them. And around the edges, in runes, are inscriptions. And runes, for those who don't know, are a Scandinavian form of writing. They don't always function in the same way as the Latin alphabet, A, B, C. You can put them together to create words, but they're not often used for long passages of script. So you don't find historical texts written in runes or really long stories written in runes. They're usually for inscriptions, for designating possession, but they also carry other layers of association, because each rune not only stands for a letter, A, B, C, they also stand for a word. So oak tree, ice, water, but they also then have a subsequent set of associations, which is why we end up with this connection between runes and mysticism and spirituality, that they are somehow connected to weird, which is fate. And so finding them on this box, which was clearly made in the same sort of time as the Loftus Princess, in the same sort of area, probably made in Hexham or Ripon up in Northumberland. And what's also interesting about the Franks Casket is it includes scenes from Christian stories. There's Jewish history on there, there's Roman history on there, but there's also Germanic mythology. And I want to draw attention to this individual here. This seems to be the story of Welland the Smith. Now, he was the finest smith of his time, so he caught the attention of the king Nidund, and Nidund only wanted Welland to make jewelry for him, so he had him imprisoned on an island and hamstrung, the tendons behind the backs of the thighs cut so he wouldn't be able to escape. Essentially, he was being enslaved to work perpetually for the king. But Welland wanted to exact revenge. So he first of all lures the son of the king over to meet with him, promising him treasures. He kills the son. He fashions a goblet out of the son's skull. And then he lures over the daughter, Hilda, and he uses the goblet to give her wine, which has been drugged. He impregnates her, and then he manages to escape on a flying machine that he had made from the feathers of birds. And that whole little mythological story seems to have been condensed and shown here on the side of the Franks Casket. You can see Welland over there. His hand is cupping the goblet. He has the jeweler's tongs and hammers around him, and the son is underneath him, and the daughter is reaching out to receive the goblet. And then the birds are symbolic of this flying machine that he will escape on. Why do I tell you this story? I tell you this story because when I look at the Loftus Princess's pendant, I automatically think of how prized that object would have been. So Germanic mythology was coming back into England after the collapse of Rome in 410 because of the arrival of Angles, Saxons and Jutes, who were bringing with them their gods, their goddesses. It's where, of course, where we end up with the days of the week, Thor's Day, Freya's Day. They really influenced the religious and cultural climate of England for a good 200 to 300 years. And these stories would have been well known, and their association with the preciousness of making jewelry would have also been appreciated. There is an alchemy to it, if you think about it. Jackie mentioned at the beginning a series I made called Handmade in Bolton, which I think is on iPlayer at the moment. And I made that with the Bolton forger, Sean Greenhalgh, who is just the most incredible person. He has served time for his role in deceiving the Met, the Louvre, even the British Museum, in terms of his incredible forgeries from across art history. But since he has come out of prison, he has been sharing his techniques, his artistry, his skills as a craftsperson. And one of the things he made with me in that show was a gold and garnet cloisonné image of an eagle. And in the process of watching him make it, I learned so much, because in order to get gold from a solid ore form to a liquid that you can then cast in a mold, you're looking at temperatures in the thousands. It's magical almost that it goes from solid to liquid back to solid. And it defies the passage of time, of course. It can be buried in the ground for 1,000+ years and come out as perfect as it went in. There's all of that involved in it. And the skill at cutting the garnets, shaping them, I learned so much. And it taught me another level of appreciation for these objects, that they are fine art. Need I say more than show you the Sutton Hoo shoulder clasp, the most extraordinary example of this golden garnet cloisonné work, dating to around 620 AD, part of a collection of objects that were buried in a ship in the ground, probably to commemorate a great ruler. It's been suggested King Radwold of the East Angles. But everything I've been describing to you is visible here. The animal interlace, the zoomorphic design with the boars at one end and the serpents writhing along the edges, and the symmetry, the delight in the materials of gold and garnet, and the artistry that goes into making this is something else. You hopefully can see on this screen, if you press your faces up close, that each of those sections is a shaped garnet, and that it's held in place with no sort of adhesive. It's purely the pressure of each of the cells pushing against each other that has meant it has survived perfect after being buried for 1,400 years. Behind each of these very thinly cut garnets is a piece of gold foil. Hopefully you can see that, because if you look inside the shapes, they're not square, that would, or diamond rather, that would have been easier for the craftsperson to achieve, but they're showing off their virtuosity by creating a sort of truncated pyramidal effect. And that is hard. But behind those garnets is a absolute slither of gold foil. And that slither of gold foil has been punched with a checkerboard effect. So you should be able to see it inside the cells, this sort of set of squares. But what is extraordinary is when you look inside each of those squares, there is another tiny checkerboard inside that square. Now this object is about this big. Each of those units is less than a centimetre. This is skill that is having to be achieved with no running water, no artificial light, in hostile weather conditions. How is this being done? And it is this artistry that I want to celebrate, but I also want it to act as a lens to bring this period, the 7th century in England, to life. And I want to do that through the Loftus Princess and the people that are buried around her. So if we look at some of the other finds from the site, this is from the other big important grave, the 43. You can see another string of exotic beads. There's coral there. There's different materials that would have had to have been imported. But the thing I want to draw attention to are these 2 coins that sit on the shoulders. And they are already old, because at this point in the 7th century, there isn't minting of coins taking place. So these are presumably coins that have been found. They were already about 500 years old when they were reused, and they have been chosen for what they depict. They to me, this suggests that the people walking on this headland on the Northumbrian coast in the 7th century, they were acting as amateur archaeologists. They knew this site had been occupied again and again over hundreds and hundreds of years, and they have found these coins, and they have found them of interest, and they have reused them, they have repurposed them. Why do that? Because it ties them back through time, through the landscape. But there's also an artistic reason, I think, that they have done this. Look at those two coins. On the front, what would have been the way they were found in the grave, they were facing out, are two stylized horses. So you can see the mane, you can see the shape of the horse, and the way that they've been positioned, it looks like the horse on this side is galloping across to meet up with the horse on this side who is galloping off. That's a deliberate choice to position them in that way. But there's something else going on here, because on the other side of the coins, you have these images you can see below. This is what would have been pressed up against the body. And both of the coins have designs of a cross, the shape of a cross. So some choice has been made on the part of the person commissioning, wearing, owning this object to have those cross symbols pressed against them. They're not being shown outwardly, but they're there. And this seems to be a common theme around this move from, let's say, 600 AD, all kind of clustering around that time. This is the Eccles brooch. It's in a private collection now, so sadly, this is the only image I have of it. But on the outside, you have two serpents knotted, a double-headed dragon, all very common motifs from early medieval pieces. But on the inside, on the place that you wouldn't see on a belt buckle, there is a fish. And the fish, it seems, is one of the earliest Christian symbols that arrives. So its meaning comes from ichthyos, which is the Greek word for fish, and it's an anagram for Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. That's why you still see a fish as a symbol for Christianity. So this is about reveal and conceal. What people see, what the owner knows is there. And around this time too, we start to see a change in the coordination of space in these objects. So earlier pieces from the 5th century, the 6th century, they might be arranged on a triskel, a triplet, the number 3 being important, it seems, to Woden, the chief of the Germanic gods. But as we go into the 7th century, it starts to be articulated on a cross shape. Can you see that in this object here? This is the Kingston brooch. It's in the World Museum in Liverpool. And the whole shape is being articulated around a cross. So the number 4 becomes really significant. The 4 rivers of the Holy Land, but also the 4 natures of Christ, the 4 evangelists. Number 4 is actually very significant. I'm going to have to hurry up because I'm not going to get onto Jadwiga. Suffice to say, the reason I wrote this chapter was to bring the Loftus Princess into a context of ideological transformation. And we know this ideological transformation is happening because we have a historian, the Venerable Bede, who records it. He tells us that it all really revolves around women. So you'll see here the Church of St. Martin's in Canterbury and an object known as the Ludhard medalette. These are directly associated with Queen Bertha. She married the King of Kent, and with her, she brought Christian practices and literacy and Christian symbolism and her own bishop, Ludhard, over from France. Here he is. This is her personal bishop, Bertha, Ludhard. And she was drawing inspiration from great Christian rulers on the continent. These are images now from Ravenna. You can see the Empress Theodora there. She is in her imperial garb. And please note, because I'll come back to it, the shell shape over her head. You've also got a frieze there from San Apollinare in Clasp, which also shows these martyrs with conch shells over their head. And note that her husband, Justinian, is not shown in that way. But take a look before I move on at her jewelry. Look at her necklace. Look at what she and her assistants are wearing. They're cabochons. They are favouring amethyst, different sorts of stone. And these are going up in the 6th century. Now, when we look back at what's going on in England, there is a change in fashion. This is an object known as the Dasbury Necklace. You can see cabochon garnets all the way around. and in the center, that most Christian of symbols, the cross. Now, if we turn back to My Lady, to the Loftus Princess, these are two of the cabochons that were found with her. So we get a sense of this woman, although she is right up on the edges of the known world and the edge of the coast, she is connected with the fashion, the ideas, the changes that are taking place in Christian Europe, in Ravenna and over in Byzantium, in Constantinople. So we're seeing her as bringing this new ideology, Christianity, but also new ideas, new fashions, new tastes with her. This is reinforced again and again through women. The number of early medieval bed burials found are quite minimal, but in almost all cases, those laid out in a bed are usually women, and they are often found with objects like these. So both these crosses were found in the burials of women who were also buried in beds like our Loftus Princess. What is going on? And I want to think a little bit about the people around them. So Cuthbert, St. Cuthbert is probably one of the most famous people at this point. Bede writes here that many people disgraced the faith, they did unholy deeds and neglected the creed, but they had recourse to idolatrous remedies as if by charms or amulets or any other mysteries of the magical art. So Bede is lamenting that these earlier connections to physical objects are really hard to get rid of. And indeed, Cuthbert himself, who Bede is writing about, he tricked people for centuries by having his own protective amulet in his burial. This is the Cuthbert cross. This is the coffin he was interred in with its symbolism on the surfaces. He was wearing an object like these women to indicate that he was at the junction of two worlds. On the one hand, Christian burials should have nothing in them. It should just be a shroud, no objects. You don't need objects for the afterlife when the afterlife is a perfect heaven. The older tradition, where you put everything a person might need in their grave, that's connected to ideas of Valhalla, that in fact you will need your weapons, your precious objects, food, drink, clothing, to take you on to Valhalla or to Freya's realm. But Cuthbert sits at the point between these two worlds. And that's why I think the Loftus Princess, these other early Christian women were including these objects in their grave. And the whole of that landscape is a powerhouse for influential women. So just nearby to where the Loftus Princess are the sites of Whitby and Hartlepool. Both of these were run by this powerful abbess, Saint Hilda. She's now known as Saint Hilda. And why would these 7th century English women choose to embrace this new religion? Well, there's a number of reasons. For one, they could set up their own abbeys. And once they did this, which indeed Hilda did very successfully, they could develop education. They could continue to live very luxurious lives. These are finds from the early monastery. And you can see there's, very glamorous hairpins. There's all sorts of carvings. There's evidence of writing, of learning. I like to think if I'd lived then, I would have been quite taken by this new world of opportunity for women. And indeed, when Bede comes to describe Hilda, he actually compares her to a shining necklace. Hilda's mother has a dream. She finds the most precious necklace under her garment. While she was looking on it very attentively, it seemed to shine forth with such a blaze of light that it filled all Britain with the glory of its brilliance. So there is a direct connection here with this individual Hild, who was probably alive in the same place at the same time as my individual, the Loftus Princess. And by understanding what's happening for her and how powerful and influential she is becoming, indeed, she was responsible for running one of the most important synods of the time, the Synod of Whitby. Hilda is an incredible and influential woman. And all of this, for me, gives a sense of a moment in time, a moment when these women were grabbing the opportunities that were being given to them by this new exotic import, Christianity. They were using it to benefit themselves, to enrich themselves, empower themselves, and to maintain control on a religious and a political level. And this curiosity doesn't go away, because I know you may be aware, just last month before, the discovery of Queen Kynethryth's monastery in Cookham in Berkshire, they think they found her her abbey. And again, you see this all the way through the 7th, 8th, 9th century, that medieval women could be incredibly influential and empowered by working within this system of early monasteries and abbeys. I am running out of time. What I will do is I will introduce you very quickly to Jadwiga. I will talk about one object, then I will go to questions because I have completely overrun, and I will have to come back and do another part of the talk for you on another occasion. But I want to move on quickly because from the 7th century to the 14th, this, and also from Northern England over to Poland. I don't know if any of you have ever visited Krakow. It used to be the capital of Poland. Of course, there's now Warszawa, but it is a trading town. It's part of the Hanseatic League. It was the powerhouse of Eastern Europe at this point, a place of great culture, great sophistication. Now, I said that this section is called Kings because there were only 2 women that have held the title of king in European history, and that is Jadwiga and her sister Mary. And they were not queens, they were kings, deliberately so. This is because of this treaty that was written by her father, King Louis. He had no sons, he had 3 daughters. And as he was getting to the end of his life, he realized that this fragile state that he created, you can see it in this map in the middle here, this large relationship between Hungary, Poland, and then looking over towards Lithuania, that could be under serious threat without a male heir. So he makes this declaration to the people of Krakow, and he says, I will give you loads of rights, loads of land, loads of influence, if you accept my daughter as king when I die. And they say that Poland has never had a queen. They don't have any fabric in place for a female leader. So if he does die, they will declare his daughter a king so that she can inherit the throne. And she does indeed rule as king. But what I wanted to do in this chapter, I'm part Polish myself, half Polish, 3/4 Polish, and I wanted to highlight how our misconceptions of the medieval period don't only extend to our own surroundings, but to the whole landscape of Europe at this time. We have a sense now, don't we, that Poland is Eastern Europe, or at a push, might say Central Europe. But during the 14th century, it was the most powerful empire. It was a golden age. You can see here the rulers that in succession from 1370 onwards, they were the most influential and powerful people in Europe. Now, Jadwiga was actually part of the House of Anjou. So her line ties back to Anjou in France. And when she becomes king of Poland, you can see her seal here, she brings with her the connection to chivalry, to the idea of romance, of the heart of all of that in Paris, in France. And that all then ebbs into the court in Krakow. I promise there is so much more I could tell you. These are some of the art objects connected with Jadwiga. And if I, in the Loftus Princess chapter, was focusing on archaeology and artifacts, in the Jadwiga chapter, I'm really concerned with the art, because she has been eulogized, she's been declared a saint, there has been all manner of misrepresentation, misuse of her life, of her image for centuries, often through nationalistic tendencies. That Poland it disappeared from the map for over 100 years through partition, and then was subjected again after the war to Soviet control. And through Jadwiga, there's always been a sense of a great age of Poland, a time that Polish people could tie themselves to while they're undergoing trials and tribulations. And so it is so hard to get to the real Jadwiga, because century upon century, she's become this sort of poster girl for a golden age of Poland. And a saint, of course. So the way her life has been written is in a certain style, it's in a certain framework. But I wanted to go back to the raw evidence. I've gone back to the archival evidence, the textual evidence, but the things that she was responsible for having made, and the things that we know she owned, for me, speak volumes about the sort of person she was. I am going to speed up. These are 3 objects. The crucifix she had imported from Italy, which she prayed in front of, a beautiful example of 13th century wooden sculpture, metalworking. This rationale in the center is still worn by the bishops of Krakow, and it has her insignia on the ends. It's about loyalty to God, and lots of little objects are turning up in collections that have Jadwiga's coats of arms on them, which is the joint arms of Anjou and the Hungarian-Polish Empire, including this little crystal cup in Dresden. But the one I wanted to finish on, and this is to give you a sense of how complex and diverse the medieval world can be, is this little known object. It still isn't displayed, it's virtually unrecorded. It's an arms pouch dating to about 1340, made in France. And you can see the style in which it's made. It's opus Anglicanum. It's got split stitch, long stitch, joint stitch, most of it stitched in gold thread. And it's made of silk. And we know it was in the collections in Krakow because it's recorded in an inventory in the 16th century. But it's never had any sustained investigation done on it. So I wanted to look at this because it would have held a relic, and it right from the beginning has been associated with Jadwiga. What does it show on the surface? Well, you have two scenes. One where there is a woman reaching out for a man who is pulling at another man, pulling at his neck, pulling at his hair, while another individual looks out of a window above. And on the other side, the same woman is being led by a man who is barefoot up a mountain, while another individual stands behind reading something. Nobody really had put forward any convincing sources for this, apart from that they probably come from the legend of Tristan and Isolde. One of the romances focusing on Isolde of Cornwall. It's a love triangle with her husband, King Mark, and ultimately it's about adultery and betrayal. But that nobody could pinpoint exactly what scene was taking place. And then I found there were these two manuscripts, one in Oxford, one in Bern, and they refer to a specific incident that doesn't occur in the other standard texts of this romance. It's an episode known as the Madness of Tristan, and it describes how Tristan goes in disguise to Tintagel Castle to try and to spend some time with Isolde. He goes there dressed up as a madman. He behaves in, it says here in this extract, he turned to them, the court thought he was mad himself. He shouted as if at a wolf. And in this chaos and in this world turned upside down moment, he manages to get to Isolde, and she eventually recognizes him, and it's, happy romance ensues. But this is what I think is going on in this image, because you can see Isolde, she has this wonderful tippeted dress, she's holding her gown up, but she's reaching out to stop the individual in front of her, who is clearly a knight. He has a sword, he's dressed in knightly garb, and he is pulling at another man as if he is mad, enraged. Up at the top, you see King Mark looking down on the scene, and that is exactly what is described in this manuscript. The king saw him right away. If this is the episode of the Madness of Tristan, it suggests, A, that Jadwiga was bringing French romance, bringing these stories with her to Krakow, and bringing this sort of art with her to Krakow. But also there's a story going on here, because this is a scene of chaos, of disarray. This is the world turned upside down. And that is what this object is implying, that this is a bad thing, that adultery will lead to chaos. And this is reinforced by the other side. This episode is clearly taken from the end of the romance, when Tristan and Isolde have been living in the woods in fear. They realize they were wrong to have run off with each other, that she's made a huge mistake, and she wants to go back to her husband and back to her court. The man behind is probably reading the letter from her husband, King Mark, where he says, "I forgive you, come back to me." And this hermit, or again, is leading her back to civilization, to culture. So the whole object, the whole bag seems to have a message underlying it of doing one's duty as a wife, doing one's duty to avoid pitfalls like adultery. And as the chapter goes on, of course, I can explain to you in more detail why this is relevant to Jadwiga. But ultimately, as a very, very young girl, she was forced to choose between the man that she loved, William, the King of Austria, and a man who was over 30 years older than her, who was the king of Lithuania, king of the last pagan corner of Europe. And she tried to get back to her lover. These are images from Polish painters of that sort of struggle to get to him. But ultimately she chose duty, she chose this older husband, and in doing so, she managed to Christianize the last corner of Europe. And that's one of the things she's most remembered for. But she should be remembered for so much more. She brought culture, she brought art, she brought intelligence to the court. She spoke 7 languages. She was fascinated by science. These are images I'll finish with from her personal Psalter, a little manuscript that was made for her by her friend, the Bishop of Krakow. And all of the illustrations are directed at Jadwiga to entertain her, to expand her mind. You can see again her coats of arms, but look at these little creatures here. Can you see Yoda and Gandalf? And then there are all sorts of curiosities in the margin, things like the zodiac signs. There seems to be numerical problems in there. This is what she owned. We are peering over the shoulder of King Jadwiga as we look at this manuscript, and we are able to get back to the real woman, not the hagiographied saint of a savior of Poland, but somebody who really lived, breathed, existed in 14th century Krakow and touched these objects. That is all from me. I know I haven't left much time, but thank you all so much for listening to me.
Nina, thank you so much. Wow, that was an amazing sort of whirlwind tour of at least 2 of the chapters of your book. Thank you ever so much. And I'm sorry we are a little tight for time, but if people will forgive us, we will probably extend by just 5 or 10 minutes just to give a chance for some of the great questions that have come in over the course of your talk. Morag asked quite early on, I think towards your introduction, when you were talking about what it was that has fired you up to do this research and to write the new book. She's asked quite a specific question, but she says very unglamorous sources like the Scottish Kirk session records, which are now digitized, have nearly 450 years of women's interactions, but they were strip mined by the Victorians for atypical horror stories of things like witch burning. And she asked, do you think that women, sometimes we can be our own worst enemies by going for the most extreme examples like witches, rather than looking maybe at the more mundane sort of everyday experience, which isn't as exciting, but of course, as she says, most women were not burned. I suppose that's a question really about the sources and you know, as a historian, as an art historian, where you turn to and what you do to question those sources.
I think it's a fantastic question with lots of layers that I want to unpack, but we haven't got a huge amount of time, so I'll just unpack them quickly. In terms of finding normal people, everyday people, it is a hard exercise, but it is a hugely rewarding one. And I try to use different sources, as I said, to get back to that. But Morag makes the very important point that they are mined by Victorian writers. And this is the premise of the whole book. When you read it, you'll see how it all falls into place. But the title Femina was a term that I found in manuscripts where later 18th, 19th century archivists, librarians have excised library catalogues and put the word femina next to them because they were written by a woman or they relate to a woman. And then those documents have been burned, destroyed, lost. So it's the actual writing out of history of women. And that deliberate act, which has, of course, conditioned how we see ourselves today. We are inheriting something that is only a couple of 100 years old, but it is so, it feels so established that we assume that must be what it was like centuries before. And that's why I'm writing the book, to challenge those assumptions. So it's a really important point that Morag makes. I'm very glad she's made it. And I think that, are we our worst enemies going for more extreme examples, e.g. witches? I started off talking about the goddess book I've written. I think that often and in for many young people, myself included, young woman trying to be interested in the past, was to be excited by those extremes, Anne Boleyn, and then as I said at the beginning, all these wonderful deities and different individuals. So sometimes it's the sensational that grabs the interest, but I find the more mundane to be the more rewarding, and that's why in each chapter I world build, I create a texture. We might just have one person we know the name of, but that doesn't mean we have to ignore everyone else. Archaeology can bring them to life better than most subjects, but there are records like the session records. There are all sorts of accounts that really add texture. So it's the sort of detective work that I love.
Well, on detective work, Andrea had a question. I think when you were talking about the Sutton Hoo, that amazing piece of jewellery that you showed us, she said, I often wonder about magnification. Do you have any thoughts about what might have been used to achieve this? I mean, because you talked about, you know, natural light, weather conditions, you know,
Yeah.
all of those sort of difficulties that artists would have faced. So how could they have made those things so incredibly intricately?
Well, again, this is a wonderful question, and one that my students always ask me. It's the first thing, you know, how did they do it on such a microscopic level if they didn't have magnification? We know they probably didn't have magnification. Glass is coming about 13th century. Magnifying glass, you don't get clarity of glass until quite late on, almost the Industrial Revolution. Most glass is viscous. You can't always see through it. Crystal can be clear, translucent, but it's not very good for magnification. So I think we can exclude the notion that they're using some sort of magnifying glass. There's also a second layer to this, which is that there was clearly an idea of apprenticeship that took place with this sort of craft work, that an apprentice would be allowed to do smaller bits, more mundane jobs, while the master craftsperson would then turn their hand to the finish, to the really intricate bits. But eyesight deteriorates with age. So while the hand is becoming more sophisticated, the eye is becoming less capable. So we really do wonder how some of these pieces must have been created. I'm sure there are exceptions to the rule. There must have been older people who managed to maintain the quality of their eyesight, but they do beg a belief. They really do.
We've had a question also about your mentioned your interdisciplinary approach, and obviously you showed us some of that in that last example of amazing King Jadwiga, with that amazing embroidery work and how you've looked at the literary sources. But someone has asked, where does art history sit for you, sort of within not necessarily a hierarchy, but all of those different disciplines that you are looking at, particularly for this book?
Yeah, art history is it's my subject. It's the subject I teach. It's the subject everything comes back to art history for me, because I'm a visual person and I enjoy visual evidence. And as I said, you know, architecture, even archaeological finds, so many of them are dismissed as archaeology, but they are artifacts that can be studied with the eye of the art historian. And in almost every chapter, I've tried to foreground objects, foreground artworks, because they are the true witnesses of the past. You know, texts are often translated, passed down, copied, changed, edited, whereas an object, if it can speak, would speak of what it saw at the time. And we as art historians have to listen to them, listen to their voice and hear what they have to tell us about it. So I think it is, for me, the sort of center of the spider's web that everything else crawls out from. But as a medievalist, I can't ignore the overlap between the disciplines. I never have. I've always worked in an interdisciplinary manner, because that's where the real revelations come from. We don't have the gluts that, say, a 19th century art historian might have of newspaper articles, of text, of many sources of imagery and photographs. We're often working with a fraction of the evidence. So by putting it on an interdisciplinary canvas, you're able to sort of build up the jigsaw puzzle a little bit more, work out how the pieces fit together. And yes, I think art history for me is just that it's my safe place. It's where I go back to. If I'm ever struggling with an individual, with a chapter, I always return back to the object and say, right, what does it tell me? And that's my leveler again, brings me right back. So yeah.
And I sense very much from everything, well, from the TV programs of yours that I've seen, but also from everything you said tonight, which I really appreciate, the fact that you look at material, all of that material culture, whether it's, yeah, an illustrated manuscript, a piece of medieval embroidery, a piece of jewellery, you sort of see them all on the same level. You're not sort of hierarchizing, as some people do, painting or sculpture, which seems in many ways a very bizarre thing to do, but it does happen sometimes, I know.
It does. The three graces are, underlie our discipline, don't they? And kind of ties back to Morag's question about the democratic approach to the past, a sort of social history I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, where we try and put everyone back on the canvas and, maybe don't look at just high status objects, but look at all sorts of objects. And maybe we don't set painting, sculpture, architecture separately from crafts, from the things that hands make. Maybe we look at them all together, and that gives us a clearer view of the society on a more broader scale.
And I'm interested to know, just back to your book, maybe as a last question, I'm really fascinated to know, just point us towards some of the kind of bigger conclusions that you draw, because obviously, you know, your whole thesis is about what happens when you reintroduce these amazing women back into the story of the medieval world across obviously many, many centuries. Yeah, can you just give us a hint of some of the sort of the big conclusions that we might be excited by when the book comes?
I think, I mean, the reason that myself, my publishers, people who've read bits of the book are excited is because I don't think the medieval period has been done in this way before. Because yes, I have put women back into the center of the story, but as I said at the beginning, I'm not excluding anybody else from that narrative in the process. I'm building pictures. I think the big takeaway points will be, oh my God, just how recent our misogyny, our sense of social division, our attitudes towards class, towards race, towards sexuality, there's such a recent invention. And I open the whole book with this incredible medievalist who you probably know. She was the suffragette who threw herself in front of a horse at the Derby, Emily Wilding Dickinson. She was a medievalist. And in her text, she says, I want to break off the shackles of this Victorian life and go back to an earlier time where women had influence. That's what I want to be telling people. But yes, they did. Sure, there were problems. Sure, there was all sorts of disadvantages that women's experienced across the full centuries of the medieval period. But there were opportunities and there were support networks and there were so many things that women could do. And maybe as we go forward as women, we can look to that. And we can find hope in that. And we can say it's not always been this way. We can change it going forward. And just be more realistic about this period. You know, the idea that there is a dark age, a middle age, where everybody is ignorant, everybody is superstitious, everybody is, you know, burning witches and chanting prayers. That is not real. It was like as complex as our world is today, just in a different setting, a different environment. So I'm looking for that complexity of society. I'm looking to build a real textured medieval world.
Brilliant. Well, I can't wait for the book. And I suppose the real last question, which at least a dozen people have already asked, is where can we buy your book? Where should we go to find it?
Aren't you all lovely? You know, it'd be amazing if people did pre-order, because it really, really helps when the book then comes out. It sort of generates excitement. So the big ones, isn't it? The big old Amazon. Waterstones are great. Blackwell's have got it online, and you can pop a pre-order in and then it will drop through your letterbox magically in March, and you can tell me what you think of it then.
Fantastic. I think at that point, given that we have run over by a good 10 minutes, we should probably say a massive, massive thank you to you, Nina. That was just an amazingly inspiring talk. I have to say it completely whetted my appetite for your book, which just looks fascinating, even how you structured it and the sort of those kind of archetypes, as you say, of the type of leaders or rulers or powerful people that you've then put the voices of women back into. So thank you so much for sharing it with us tonight. And thank you to our audience of about 400 people who have been firing questions away, and I know thoroughly enjoying it in the background. And as I said at the beginning, the festival, the Art History Festival, continues through this week, and there are still tickets available, particularly for some of the online events. So do go to the Association for Art History's website and check it out. And thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Nina.
Absolute joy. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you, Jackie.
Thanks.